Hey, Jeremy with Strength in Numbers again. If you're one of the 9% of people on this planet that owns a car, they are not free to operate. We're going to talk today about some of the costs you're probably forgetting to plan for. Whether you have a car payment or not, and I really hope you don't, there are many other costs that are associated with owning and operating a vehicle. And I want to talk to you today about 8 specific ones you should be planning for, and I'm willing to bet you're probably not planning for at least half of them. So let's start with the most obvious one, car insurance. Whether you have a car, truck, or motorcycle or not, you're going to need to have that car insurance in place. In fact, most states, I think all except 2, require it in order to operate the vehicle. It's very much for your own best interest. But it doesn't mean that you have to be paying too much for that car insurance. So if you haven't requoted your car insurance in a while, find an independent broker that you can trust that's going to run multiple quotes and find you the best coverage for the best price. They don't work for a particular insurance company, which means they're not a captive agent. So find an independent broker and requote your auto insurance. Next, let's talk about what I call the little 3. First up on this list, car registration. You may be thinking, well, that's not very much of a cost. Why do I need to set aside money for that? I can just cover it when it comes. But that's what reactionary spending is like. How would it feel to have the money set aside so that every year, 2 years, depending on where you are, you have the money set aside for registration? In my case, it'd be $90 every 2 years. And that's not $90 that can just suddenly come and broadside you and knock your expenses out of whack, or $90 that you don't have to be able to spend somewhere else to keep within your means. It's easier just to plan ahead and think long term. And hand in hand with that, in your area may be called inspection. Here we call it emissions for the vehicle. That's the check that needs to be done every year to 2 years, depending on where you are, and having that money set aside as well. And lastly, in little 3 is the licensures. You're going to need to pay for the license costs. Again, that may be very infrequent. Here it's every 6 years, but it's $72. That could be surprising you if you're not prepared for that. And I don't know where it is other states, but here it's on your birthday. It's not a very fun birthday present when you suddenly got to fork out money for a license because you forgot to plan for that. So that's the little 3. Next, let's talk about what I call the big 3. So first up on this list is car repairs. The car is going to break at some point. It's not perfect. And even if it doesn't have major issues, you're still going to have to replace the brakes, brake pads, those types of things that are going to need to be replaced. So set aside money for car repairs and be prepared for those things that are going to break eventually, depending on how long you keep the car. It could be alternator, God forbid it's something huge like transmission or whatever, but you need to have money set aside for car repairs, which is, by the way, one of the #1 emergencies people come up with, saying, I had no money prepared for car repairs. So you need to have that money set aside. RepairPal can be a great place to look up and find in your area some estimates as to what certain repairs could cost. You can help get some numbers in mind, although I find them to be a little high when you're using an independent mechanic, which I definitely recommend, and you can read my blog post about that. But set aside money on a regular basis so that when you need to have that $300 alternator replaced, you don't have to scramble to come up with $300. Secondly, in the big 3 is maintenance. So we talked about repairing the vehicle, but you also need little things to maintain it, such as wiper blades, windshield washer fluid, oil changes, and the like. So make sure you're setting aside either as part of your repair budget, it depends on how you like to do it, or a separate maintenance budget. Make sure you're having money set aside for those things as well. And the last of the big 3 is tires. Now I have a whole separate video on my method of how I save at least $200 every time I buy a set of 4 tires, so make sure you watch that. But you've got to have the money set aside to be able to buy the tires. This is easily a $400 purchase, all the way up to $1,000 or higher, depending on the size of your tire, the vehicle it fits, and things like that. It can be a tremendous amount of money, and every 2 to 3 years, depending on your driving style, that can be a huge amount of money. So make sure you're setting aside money for tires. And lastly, the big granddaddy. Now, that's called property tax on your vehicles. Now, if you live in a state where there's no property tax on your vehicle, I'm really trying very hard right now to not be jealous of you. Maybe I'll come visit and move there, I don't know. But car property tax is a yearly bill oftentimes. Some towns will break it down into 2 6-month installments, but you're gonna have to pay a privilege tax basically for living in the state and owning a vehicle. You've got to set aside that money because that, again, is similar to tires and cost. It can be $300-400, it can be $200, it can be all the way up to $1,000. I've seen higher than that. So you need to make sure you know what that amount is. If you've got records, go back and review that. If you don't know, call the tax assessor, not the tax collector. Call the tax assessor at your local town hall, because it is a town by town excise tax that is then handed up to the state in most states. So you've got to be able to come up with that And that can be a huge budget buster, a huge expense that you were not expecting just because you weren't thinking long term. So this has been 8 things you should be setting aside for maintaining a vehicle on top of any car payment you hopefully don't have. And I hope that you found some value with this. Pass this along to others you know who own a vehicle and let them glean from the tips as well. This is Jeremy with Strength in Numbers, helping keep your wallet heavy and your heart light.